Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our webinar. I'm David Block-Jactor. I'm the Chief Business Officer at Transit. I'm sharing hosting duties, so my colleague Marisa Henry can focus on, actually presenting. I promise other than what I'm about to say, you'll hear from her, not me. Expect the presentation itself to be about 15 minutes. We'll leave 15 minutes for questions at the end to give you plenty of time to prep for whatever is next on your schedule. Her presentation is fantastic. For those of you who are able to see it live at the Canadian Urban Transportation Association conference in Montreal in October, you already know that. And for those who weren't, you're in for a treat. So what I want to do is to contextualize what she'll be presenting just for a little bit. So Marisa will be focusing on ghost buses. It's a tangible part of a theme that we think is important. The theme namely being, how do we move away from governance by who complains the loudest? There are people out there who think that the way to get more things done is to stop focusing so much on getting feedback and public input. We think that's misguided. Rather than reducing the amount of feedback agencies receive, we think it starts by increasing the number and the diversity of the voices that we solicit feedback from. It means agencies hear from all of their riders all of the time and can use that information to make the best decisions as quickly as possible. And that's what we're trying to enable for agencies. More feedback from people who don't have the time or inclination to complain when something goes wrong. Maybe even feedback occasionally when, as with 95% of the trips people take on public transit, everything goes fine and they get where they're going without any incident. With so many transit agencies already short-staffed, truly listening to more feedback can seem impossible. Short, focused questions about riders' rides when they are riding allow us to gather more information in a way that's actionable and ultimately replaces anecdote with data. So if you signed up for this webinar, we'll be sending along a recording shortly. So if your colleague or my mom signed up, don't worry, you don't need to take notes. You'll get to experience the whole thing just without us around to answer the questions. And speaking of questions, if you ask your questions in the Q&A section at the bottom of the Zoom window, we'll make sure that they get answered at the end of the session. If you have any ideas for a question that you'd like to ask riders as well, you can let us know in the same place. We might already have asked it, and if we haven't, maybe it'll spark some great ideas. And now with that, I'll turn it over to Marisa.
Thanks. Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here today. And thank you, David, for the introduction and the bit of context surrounding this presentation. So like David mentioned today, I'm going to talk to you all about Transit's new Rate My Ride feature and how it can be used to help transit agencies improve their operations. But before I dive into the details of Rate My Ride, I'm going to do a quick talk about Transit overall for those of you who might be a little bit less familiar with our app. At its core, Transit helps people get from A to B without needing their own car. It was started 10 years ago in Montreal with a focus on getting around using public transit, but it's since expanded to include additional forms of transportation like biking, bike share, and car share. The app is built on shared data specifications like GTFS, which enables us to include transit feeds from more than 300 cities worldwide, all in one app. These 300 cities are spread across 16 different countries, so even as our users travel or move from place to place, Transit can remain their go-to app for getting around. We also partner with over 100 agencies across these metro areas, providing support to them to help them improve their operations and make using public transit more convenient for their riders. One item that continually comes up in conversations with our partner agencies is the challenge of who gets heard. Hearing from riders themselves helps agencies prioritize issues in their system to improve operations as effectively as possible. But collecting this rider feedback at scale in a timely and representative manner isn't so simple. Traditionally, rider feedback has been collected using both in-person surveys, but these can be costly, inconvenient to both the agency and riders, and biased towards riders who have the time to actually stop and fill out a survey on the spot. In-person meetings and consultations face really similar problems. They're often skewing towards older and already engaged riders and biased towards, again, the people that have the time to attend those kinds of meetings. Many agencies have since turned to online surveys to address some of these challenges with in-person feedback, but online surveys are still often difficult to disseminate to a representative group of riders. And all of these approaches to reaching riders rely on riders recalling information from previous trips, which may be subject to some recall bias. So to address these challenges, Transit has developed Rate My Ride, which is essentially a digital intercept survey about the trip experience. The Rate My Ride survey is asked to Transit riders who use our Go functionality, which is Transit's step-by-step trip companion. Go gives the riders instructions about their trip in real time and allows us at Transit to know when users are at a particular point in their journey. This means that we can ask users the right questions at the right points in their trip. Unlike other online surveys, we ask users for responses as their trip is actually happening, so we don't have to worry about recall bias. For example, we can ask users when their bus arrives, if it arrived when they expected, or if it was early or late. We can also see when a user didn't seem to get on the bus that we expected them to get on, and we can ask them what happened. For example, did the bus just pass them, or was it a so-called ghost bus that never appeared? And we'll dive more into this question later in the presentation. Well, not everybody that uses Transit uses Go. Many people do. So 15% of our users who open the app in a given month will complete at least one Go trip, and many will complete many, many more than just one Go trip in a month. In September of this year, we had over 125,000 Go trips a day and over 150,000 total Rate My Ride responses every day. In our experience, users are very responsive to the Rate My Ride questions. On this chart, we show the response rate for each of our standard Rate My Ride questions, and you can see that over 75% of people who get prompted to respond to a Rate My Ride question will submit a response. And for some of our questions, the response rate is actually over 95%. This is significantly higher than you might expect to see a response rate for a standard survey. We also have good reason to believe that Rate My Ride responses come from a diverse group of riders. Each quarter, we conduct a rider happiness benchmarking survey, which includes a set of optional demographic questions. Here, I'm showing some of the latest responses from this survey for users in Montreal. We had 42% of respondents reporting having an annual household income of less than $50,000 a year. Additionally, we have a decent number of students who use the app, but a majority, 72%, are actually not students, despite all the universities in Montreal. And 60% state they do not own a car or have access to one. So while Rate My Ride, this digital intercept survey, and the rider happiness benchmarking survey are two separate surveys, this data does demonstrate that Transit has a reach to a very diverse group of riders, and we would expect the responses we're getting from Rate My Ride also sort of mirror this diverse group. Part of the reason Rate My Ride has been so successful among users could be that we share responses back to other users. So there's this sense of collectively generating information about transit routes that allows riders to make more informed choices. But what's probably more interesting for most of you is that we're also working with agencies to enable them to ask custom questions in the app. These questions can be specific to certain lines or times of day to get at the data that's most relevant to the agency. We then share anonymized Rate My Ride data back with the agency so they can dive into the details of the responses. And as a reminder, if you have questions you'd like to ask, not just of riders through Rate My Ride, but also of us today at the webinar, you can submit both in the Q&A function down below on the Zoom. Okay, moving on. So each Rate My Ride response, like I said, either to one of the custom questions that an agency comes up with or the standard questions that we asked that I mentioned earlier, is linked to the date and time of the trip, the route name, an anonymized user ID, and the origin and destination stop IDs of that trip. And all of this really rich data means we can really dive deep into where the problems might be in a transit system, so we can then work to find solutions and improve operations. So to demonstrate what I'm talking about when I say that, and to demonstrate the power of Rate My Ride data, I'm going to talk about responses to our ghost bus question, which we ask when it appears that a user has missed their bus. We all know that ghost buses and users getting passed by buses are problems in every transit system, especially with the current challenges in hiring and retaining operators. But because Transit's based in Montreal, I'm going to be talking about some Rate My Ride responses that we received from riders of the STM. So in this case study, we're going to talk about two kinds of ghosts. First, buses that pass users waiting at a stop. and those that are sort of true ghost buses where the user reports that the bus just never appeared when we expected it to. So first we'll look at users getting passed by buses. Like I mentioned earlier, we have rate my ride responses by time of day. So we can explore what times of day people report getting passed by the bus more frequently. So we can see in the green bars on the chart, on the x-axis here, we have the time of day, the hour of day of the rate my ride response. And then the y-axis for the green bars is the number of users reporting buses passing them. So we can see that the number of people reporting getting passed by the bus peaks in the AM and PM commute hours and kind of aligns with how often people are using our app in general, which is shown in the gray bars. So relative to how many people are using the app, more people seem to be getting passed in the morning commute hours, while fewer people are passed later in the evening. And because Rate My Ride responses are also linked to a bus stop, that means that we can map responses by the stop where the user was passed. So in this map, we have each bubble shown is a stop where the size of the bubble corresponds to the number of users reporting being passed by the bus, divided by the number of weekly scheduled trips that serve this particular stop. So because we expect more people to report getting passed at at stops that have higher ridership, we divide this number by the number of weekly scheduled trips to sort of adjust for this bias. So in this way, we can think of the bubbles, which are bigger, as stops where more people are getting passed by buses relative to what we might expect given the scheduled trips to that stop. So on this map, you can see there are many larger bubbles sort of in the downtown area, if you're familiar with Montreal. And if you're familiar with the STM Metro, you may also notice some clusters of larger bubbles by some metro stops. There are also some more sort of random appearing bubbles scattered throughout the island. Okay, so this is all very interesting for me as a data scientist to look at charts and maps, but how is any of this helpful for an agency? Well, we can dive into each of these stops where people are getting passed more than what we might expect and start to examine why. So like I mentioned on the last slide, there are certain metro stops that have bus stops around the metro where many people are reporting getting passed by buses. One hypothesis for this is because maybe the buses are just too full to take all of the riders at these really busy locations. So as an agency, we could run more frequent trips to these stops at the times of day when people report getting passed the most. Looking into some of the more sort of scattered bus stops around the island that have higher rates of people getting passed by buses than what we'd expect, I started to wonder if maybe it's because some of these stops are just located in places where it's really hard for the bus driver to see if there are riders waiting to board the bus. Perhaps there's a solution here in prioritizing bus stop signage or bus shelters at some of these locations. Okay, now transitioning to the case of ghost buses, which is when users report the bus just never appeared. Looking at these reports again over time, we see that the ghost bus reports are more common during the peak hours, but especially during the evening commute in this case. So again, we can also map these responses. And here we have a map with the highest rate and lowest rate of ghost bus trips. The highest rate of ghost bus trips are in red, the lowest rate are in green. And similar to the previous map, the rate of ghost buses here is the number of trips that had at least one ghost bus report from a rider divided by the number of weekly trips along this route. So having this knowledge can empower an agency to dive into the details of why certain routes may have more challenges with both ghost buses than others, and then make adjustments to improve their operations. Okay, wrapping up this small case study, we saw that Rate My Ride responses suggest ghost buses and pass-ups in Montreal happen more frequently during the peak hours, and ghost buses in particular occur more frequently during the PM commute. By looking at the stops associated with Rate My Ride responses, we could identify clusters of bus stops near some metro stops that have more riders reporting pass-ups than what we might expect. So we're able to dig into all of these details and really interesting insights because we link each Rate My Ride response that we're getting from riders with the trip information that's relevant to the response, like the route, stop, and time of day. By identifying these trends in Rate My Ride responses, agencies can then target further investigation, draw some conclusions, and then take action to address problems in their system. And because Rate My Ride is ongoing, not this one-time survey, we can then continue to to monitor responses over time and track any improvements in operations that might be happening. So now I'm going to pass it back to David as we move into the Q&A section. If you haven't already, you can drop your questions again into the Q&A down below in the Zoom toolbar. And again, not just questions for us, but also if you have any questions you think might make for good Rate My Ride questions, we would love to hear them.
Great. Thanks, Marissa. So let me just put a wrap on this before we dive into the questions. What you heard is how we're working with agencies to make rider feedback more representative, more abundant, more specific, and more actionable. It's not innovative. It's obvious. You put a communication touch point in the app riders are already using. You share schedules and real-time data with riders. They share feedback as they ride. When riders can give this feedback freely and easily, they can report on positive experiences too, which can help change from governance by anecdote to governance by data. Removing this friction from that feedback is just part of breaking the negative feedback cycle, and therefore allowing more time for overworked, under-resourced agency staff, which I know I was one to focus on rebuilding ridership both now and for the long haul. So with that, yet another reminder, submit your questions through Q&A. If we don't get to all of them now, we'll follow up with you individually. And let me start with a couple that have come through, including ones that happened before. Marissa, Abby asks, why are you asking users this instead of using other data, for example, real-time data?
Yeah, we do use real-time data a lot at Transit, but often we can't tell from real-time data alone which buses are ghost buses. So asking this question through Rate My Ride gives users the opportunity to share their feedback and gives us a live reference to look at and then compare it to other data sources.
Great, thanks. Another one, Lewis asks, how do you validate what people are reporting is correct?
Yeah, we don't have necessarily a way to 100% say that a response is correct. So that's because we don't trust individual responses on their own. We instead look at trends in the data on an aggregate level. And we think that, once we aggregate all these responses together, the trend will be in the right direction.
Great. I got a third one here. One of the questions was in terms of whether the buses arrived on time. So Jesse asked, how do you distinguish between real-time and schedule data?
Yeah, so like I mentioned in Rate My Ride, we do ask users if their bus arrived when they expected it to. That was sort of the original phrasing we had of that question. And we've recently started asking slightly different versions of the question in order to determine if the person had real-time data on or not. So we can tell if the person is responding based on their expectation based on the real-time data or their expectation based on the schedule.
Cool. We have a great question and one that I think really gets to some of the heart of this, which is there was an anonymous question that asked, what's the margin of error? How well can, and more specifically, I think, than the technical details around the margin of error is really, how can we rely that's representative of the population?
Yeah, I think this goes back to the slides I had earlier in the presentation talking about our rider happiness benchmarking survey. So we're pretty confident from the results of that survey that we're reaching a really diverse group of riders. But really, like with any survey, you're never 100% going to know if you're, reaching sort of the population as a whole. I don't know if you have anything to add to that, David.
No, but I think that the next question will prompt us a little bit more. So Lingfen asked about sample bias as well. So how do you deal with sample bias from the in-app survey? And I think their explanation of what they were talking about might help us explain a little bit more. That they presume that the survey pop-up is triggered after a certain amount of time being active or idle on the app, and users who are above and below this threshold may have significant profiles, aka lead to biases. So maybe we can just go over again how it's activated, because I think that really helps reduce some of those kinds of biases.
Do you want to dive into that?
Sure, I'd love to. Rather than being triggered after a certain amount of time being active or idle on the app, it's triggered when someone uses Go, which is the only time when we have their full location in the background, which means that we are detecting when they reach certain states. That is, we detect when they've reached the stop, we detect when they're on board, we detect when they're 2 stops away, or when their journey has ended. So that helps get rid of some of those biases because it's going out to everybody who uses Go. But on that note, we had another question around Go that I was just looking for, which was that Elliot asked, what's the reasoning behind only surveying Go feature users? It seems like you're leaving out a majority of transit app users, especially those who are using it for regular daily trips where they don't really need any step-by-step instructions.
Yeah, I mean, I think that goes back to what you were just saying, David, is the reason we're using Go is because we want to know where a user is in their journey when we ask the question. So without having the real-time location of the user throughout their trip, we can't ask these questions at sort of the key point in their journey. That being said, we do run other surveys for all transit users, like the rider happiness benchmarking survey. It's just these really targeted questions that are linked to a specific point in time in the trip really have to be used when the user is using Go.
Well, I think another question that's related to that was Jonathan, who asks, are agencies able to access the raw data so that we can analyze against other variables such as ridership, service hours, et cetera? And let me just add one thing and then I'll let you finish the answer. So one of the other reasons that we use Go is because we have all of the data on which vehicle the user is on when we're asking the question. So when someone uses Go, we not only know where they're coming from and going to, but we know the route that they were taking and in fact the exact vehicle that they're on, which we don't know outside of that context, which means that when we do share the raw data, and yes, we do, completely and totally, anyone is able to access it against all of those other variables. I guess I just answered the full question. Sorry about that.
No, go for it.
Marcy asked, must riders sign up for Royale to be included in the survey and trip plan data collection? And then a couple more questions around what does Royale cost and what is the cost for agencies to have Transit app collect and review this data?
Yeah,
I guess I can take, or you can take it. You started talking.
First part. So they do not have to be signed up for Royale to be included in the survey. They just have to have and use the app. They don't even necessarily need a transit account as far as I know. And the cost for agencies, I think, can reach out to our partners at transit.app, email out, and we can talk.
Yeah, Marcy, we can follow up separately on that. Some questions digging a little bit deeper into the data itself. So Luyu asks whether they're wondering if the ratio of buses surveyed out of all of the buses in the system, is there any difference between hours, routes, locations in terms of just sort of the overall survey response, not just necessarily on ghost buses?
Yeah, I'm not sure I fully understand the question about the ratio of buses surveyed. I mean, we asked
just basically, are we biased, I guess, in, do we get more responses versus how many riders there are in the morning or the evening, or?
Yeah, I mean, we're asking these questions all the time as people are riding. So kind of like you could see in the charts that we had where we have time on the x-axis and then both rate my ride responses and app opens on the y-axis, the number of responses we're getting, trends with how often people are using the app. And it'll also be, we'll get more responses on the lines that more riders are using. So if you have a line or a route that's, not very many people are using, and maybe even fewer people are using transit when they're using that line, then of course we'll have fewer responses for those routes for Rate My Ride.
Another one on the data, actually also from Liu, are there differences specifically on ghost buses? You showed the time of day. Are there differences between the weekday and weekend?
Yeah, I actually did not look into that question. I should have. So I can't tell you with confidence, but it would be an interesting thing to dive into. We did look into briefly for Montreal the differences between night buses and buses that run during the day, and there were some differences there. So I expect there'd probably also be a difference weekend to weekday, but I can't say for sure.
Great. Going to broader questions, Jason asked whether Rate My Ride could be used as a complement or even a replacement for traditional onboard surveys, since, as we mentioned, Go collects the origin and destination data. I'll take this one. I think as a complement is really how we think about it. Traditional onboard surveys are these long, massive things that take a long time to fill out. And some of that fill out is, things that we collect automatically, as the origin, destination, the route, the time of day, all of that the user doesn't touch. And some of them are longer, whether they're travel journeys or longer surveys. Rate My Ride is really a focus on short questions that you want a lot of responses to, and you want them over time. And so we think of it as a complement because it allows you to focus. There's really expensive onboard surveys in the places where they can be the most useful, rather than doing it every 3 or 5 or 10 years, and even rarely at that. I do think that there are biases that exist in both of them. So onboard surveys, there are biases in terms of the people who are willing to sit with someone and do it for a long time. Whereas with Rate My Ride, there are, obviously some changes in who's doing it there. So I think they really work well as a complement to each other and can help you save money in the long run, I think, on both of those. Let's see. Just looking through here. One interesting question from Eve is, does the intercept survey account for a rider who takes transit with his or her family? Do we record quantitative or qualitative data on other family members riding at the same time?
We do not currently collect that information.
Great. It's an interesting idea, right? Because it's obviously a case. It's not the case all the time, but it would be, if anyone has any ideas, let us know. I'd love to figure out a way to go to figure that sort of out, that sort of thing out. Jeffrey asks, can you show us the interface for survey creation? And I can answer that one. So the answer to that is, one of the things that we do is we use our team, who is working with lots of agencies on these questions, to filter that out. So when we work with agencies to put in custom questions, we have our team help. We have a whole question bank from other questions that agencies have asked, which can help with the phrasing. So there isn't a interface for agencies to use directly, but that you work directly with us, and we work together to make sure that the questions are useful, but also that they are hopefully comparable across other agencies, so that you can get not just data for yourself, but also understand how your riders' responses compare to your peer agencies. GJ asks a question which is a little piercing, and quite frankly, I'm not quite ready to answer it, but I'm going to ask it anyway, which is, if we're Rate My Ride subscribers, thank you, GJ, will the mapping feature just appear on our dashboards? If not, how do we access the mapping feature? Marisa, spill some internal tea on this.
Yes, I wish it was that easy. Right now, all of the maps that I've shown were sort of one-off maps that I created for the purpose of this presentation, and are not something that we're currently putting into the dashboards. I would love it if we could, but it's a lot of effort to get that up and running. So we'll see, hopefully in the future.
I will say, GJ, next time we talk, let's talk about ways that we might be able to do it, because it's something, we see the power of these maps as well. It's why we're doing this webinar. We get really excited by it, and we want to figure out how we can share that so that not just the maps that we create, but that you can create your own maps with the
Yeah.
data relatively easily.
Yeah, I guess for
Lori,
if there's any data savvy people out there and they want to try and you have Rate My Right data, you can use tools like Tableau to map things relatively easily.
So Lori asks, is there a way for non-agency research or civic groups to get access to Rate My Ride data for their city? Okay, I'll answer that one. Lori, just reach out to us. Obviously we need to be very careful with how we share the data, even though it's all anonymous and private, not connected with any personally identifiable information. And we even trim the location so that it doesn't like pinpoint you down to, where you live on a city block, but just sort of the 5 or 6 kind of block group level area. We are always very careful and need to have agreements in place. So just reach out to us and we can follow up together on that. Let's see. Francine asks, do the Rate My Ride surveys use the GTFS stop route information, or can they be enabled for a geofence? For example, if a bus is off route for a detour, but we want to ask questions about the accessibility of the temporary platforms, is that doable?
Do you
You want me to answer this one,
Yeah.
don't you? Okay.
I know you can have Rate My Ride questions on specific routes, but I'm not sure about specific parts of routes.
Yeah, we haven't enabled that functionality yet, but it's something that we're definitely thinking about. The case that you gave, Francine, is a really interesting one. If you want to follow up with us, I'd love to talk to you more, because we're trying to figure out which parts of this we build next. As Marisa showed, this is something that we think has a tremendous amount of promise, and there's a lot of agencies who are already starting to use it. In fact, if you talk to us, we're happy to, as a transit agency, we're happy to also run a pilot in your area just to see, both for your experience to see if it works, but also for our experience. We're trying to get as many questions out there as possible so that we can understand more what the use cases are to really make this the most useful tool possible. And maybe I will follow up with, since we're running at a little bit more than a half hour, and I did promise this one would be quick. Maybe we'll end on this one, which kind of follows up from the last one, which is Marcy. Hi, Marcy, asking what is on the horizon for the next rev of Rate My Ride?
Do you want me to go?
You can share anything you want. Don't look for me.
Yeah, I think what we're really working on right now and focusing on is working with agencies to ask the questions that are most useful to them. So and also revising our standard questions. So like I mentioned, we launched this relatively recently, earlier this year, and we've already started revising the questions we're asking to get at more specific answers from users. And I expect we'll continue to do that over time, as well as incorporating custom questions like you can see on the slide right now. And I would love, of course, from the data science side to have a better user interface, but we'll see.
Yeah. No, I think that's a great way to wrap it up. I mean, really what's next for us is all about the questions that agencies want to ask. We've created this tool. We have all of these users, riders who are using our app on a daily basis, which is amazing. And we feel very grateful for it. And we feel the responsibility of it. And we can think of things that we think are interesting, but ultimately, I think what it really comes down to is how agencies use it. So, as I said before, the thing that we're trying to do more than anything is to get this into the hands of agencies and therefore get it into the hands of riders so that we collectively can figure out where the greatest value lies. Any parting thoughts, Marisa, before we let everyone go on to the rest of their day?
I think we've covered it.
Great, fantastic. Well, thanks everyone for coming out. Please do follow up with us with any questions that you have. And just as a final reminder, we'll be sending along the recording later today, including to my mom. So have a great afternoon and hope to talk to you all soon. Take care.
Bye, everyone.